The sun hung low over the rugged hills of Northern California, casting long, jagged shadows across the dusty, winding road that led to Blackwood Mansion. Jonathan Hale had traveled hundreds of miles from San Francisco, drawn by a historian's obsession, the whispers, rumors, and half-forgotten stories surrounding a house that seemed alive with dread. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the hilltop, as though the very mention of the mansion would summon its dark presence. A relic from 1885, the estate had been abandoned for decades, yet its grim legacy had not faded. Jonathan's carriage rattled over uneven stones as he approached the mansion. At first glance, the house seemed beautiful in its decay. Ivy strangled the once grand facade, and the sun glinted off the shattered panes of a dozen broken windows. Its stone and timber bones stood firm against time, but there was a sense that the mansion breathed, exhaling an almost imperceptible chill into the wind. The wooden gates, warped and cracked, groaned under his hand as he pushed them open. Even from the road he could feel it, the oppressive weight of history pressing down, urging him to turn back. He dismounted and paused, taking in the full scale of the estate. 3 stories of weathered stone rose above him, adorned with ornate carvings that had been weathered smooth by decades of wind and rain. Gargoyles, their features grotesque and misshapen, perched like silent sentinels along the eaves, and a faded crest above the door hinted at a family once proud and powerful. The mansion seemed to absorb sound. Even the distant cry of a hawk over the hills felt muffled. Jonathan shivered, pulling his coat tighter against the evening chill. The townsfolk had spoken of the Blackwood Sisters with a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. Eliza and Margaret Blackwood were said to have been brilliant, beautiful, and utterly merciless, daughters of a wealthy mining magnate whose fortune had rotted alongside the moral compass of the family. Rumors hinted at their involvement in a series of disappearances, some locals claiming that those who entered the mansion never left, or at least left in pieces too small to be remembered. Jonathan, skeptical but curious, could not resist the lure. Historical record or not, the stories had a magnetic pull, a dark promise of truth lurking behind the veil of superstition. He stepped through the front door, and the air inside was thick, with dust and decay, carrying the faint, sour scent of long-buried secrets. Each step on the creaking floorboards echoed unnaturally, bouncing off walls lined with faded wallpaper patterned in intricate, now grotesque floral designs. The grand foyer, once a testament to opulence, had succumbed to time. Chandeliers dangled precariously from the ceiling, their crystals dulled to a dull, ghostly gray, and the marble floors were cracked, some slabs missing entirely. Jonathan's eyes were drawn to the grand staircase at the center of the hall, a sweeping curve of dark wood that led to the upper floors. He noticed faint scratches on the banister, deep, deliberate gouges that hinted at a struggle, or perhaps a warning. The air here felt heavier, charged with a static tension that made the fine hairs on the back of his neck rise. He reached out to touch the railing, and the wood felt inexplicably cold, as though it had absorbed decades of sorrow and malice. In the east wing, the windows were boarded haphazardly, though cracks allowed glimpses of the overgrown gardens outside. Jonathan could make out twisted forms of roses and ivy, all strangled and contorted as if reflecting the mansion's own malevolent nature. Shadows moved where there should have been none. He stopped and listened. The house was silent, yet he could swear he heard faint footsteps echoing behind him. He turned swiftly, but the hall remained empty. Only the distant sound of the wind through the broken panes answered him. Pulling his journal from his satchel, Jonathan began sketching the layout, noting peculiar features: the strange alignment of the windows, the unusual thickness of the walls, the small door near the basement that seemed too narrow for any practical use. Stories had mentioned secret passages, hidden compartments, and rooms that vanished and reappeared depending on who dared to enter. He paused, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down on him, a reminder that the mansion's walls held more than dust. They held memory, and perhaps consciousness. As twilight descended, the mansion transformed. Shadows grew longer, curling along the walls like living serpents. Jonathan lit a lantern, its flickering flame revealing peeling murals of grim-faced ancestors staring down from the walls. Each portrait seemed to follow his movement with eyes that gleamed unnaturally, accusingly, as if judging him for daring to trespass. The stories of the Blackwood Sisters, of 84 lost souls hidden within these walls, suddenly felt tangible, their presence palpable in the dim light. It was then that Jonathan noticed the first anomaly. A door, slightly ajar in the north corridor, which he had not seen on any of the maps or sketches he had studied. The gap revealed a darkness deeper than the rest of the house, as if it led not just to another room but to the mansion's very heart. He felt a shiver run down his spine, a premonition that what lay beyond would test every shred of his courage. Yet his curiosity, stubborn and unyielding, drove him forward. He stepped closer, the floorboards groaning underfoot, and the air grew colder, carrying a faint metallic tang that reminded him uncomfortably of blood. The silence was absolute now, broken only by the slow, deliberate creak of the old hinges as he pushed the door open. Beyond it lay a long, narrow hallway, walls lined with dark wood panels, doors on either side shut tight as if guarding secrets, too terrible to whisper. A chill wind swept through, and Jonathan could hear faint scratching sounds, soft but deliberate, echoing from deep within the mansion. Somewhere, deep in the bowels of Blackwood Mansion, history was waiting. And Jonathan, driven by obsession and a hunger for truth, was about to awaken it. Jonathan stood at the threshold of the narrow hallway, lantern casting quivering shadows that danced along the dark wooden panels. The silence pressed against him, almost tangible, a weight that seemed to breathe with the mansion itself. Every step he took on the uneven floorboards made the walls shiver as if echoing secrets long buried. The metallic tang in the air lingered, stronger now, weaving with a subtle, decayed scent of flowers, once vibrant blooms now reduced to withered remnants of their past glory. As he moved cautiously down the corridor, he noticed peculiar markings on the walls, faint, almost imperceptible scratches that formed patterns at first glance random but, upon closer inspection, seemed deliberate. Shapes, symbols, letters etched with care, their meaning obscured by time. Jonathan crouched to examine one closely. It looked like a sequence of initials, intertwined with crude drawings of human figures. He ran his fingers lightly along the grooves, and an icy shiver ran up his arm. It was as if the marks were alive, etched not just into the wood, but into memory itself. Halfway down the hallway, he came upon the first door. It was heavier than the others, reinforced with iron bands that had rusted with age. Pushing it open with some effort, he entered a room that smelled of mildew and old wood, yet beneath it lay a faint, lingering sweetness that reminded him of perfume. The room had been a study, its shelves still lined with dust-covered tomes, journals and leather-bound ledgers. Jonathan approached one of the journals and gently opened it. The pages, brittle and yellowed, were filled with elegant handwriting, notes detailing daily events, social gatherings, and cryptic observations about the townsfolk. It was immediately clear who had written them: Eliza and Margaret Blackwood. The sisters' voices echoed across time through the careful script of ink on paper, a testament to their obsession with perfection, control, and secrecy. They wrote of visitors to the mansion, guests invited to luxurious dinners, neighbors who had slighted them, and, most chillingly, the collection, a term that seemed to reference something far darker. Jonathan felt his pulse quicken. Each word he read a hook pulling him further into the mansion's heart of horror. A sudden noise startled him, a soft whisper, barely audible, yet undeniably a voice. Jonathan froze. "Jonathan!" it called, in a voice so fragile and distant it could have been carried by the wind. He spun around, lantern light slicing through the gloom. But the hallway was empty. Another whisper followed, closer this time. "Don't leave!" Goosebumps prickled his skin. Rational thought fought with instinct. The logical mind told him the sounds were tricks of old wood settling, or perhaps the wind funneling through the broken panes. But deep down, he knew something far older and far darker lingered here. He pressed, On entering the next room, which had been a parlor, faded tapestries hung crookedly from the walls, and the remnants of a grand piano sat in a corner, keys yellowed and warped, as if no one had dared play it for decades. Jonathan noticed more markings here, carved faintly into the wooden floorboards. Numbers, dates, names. Some were scratched deep, others barely visible, yet all seemed tied together in a pattern only the sisters could understand. He crouched, tracing a series of numbers with his finger. They corresponded to years, months, days, perhaps even the dates of the victims, though the records were incomplete, leaving Jonathan to piece together a grim timeline from the fragments. As evening deepened into night, the mansion seemed to shift around him. Shadows stretched unnaturally, corners darkened to impossible depths, and a cold draft swept through hallways where no windows were open. Jonathan realized the mansion was not merely a building but a living entity, feeding off the weight of memory, despair, and death. The whispers grew more insistent, a chorus of voices layered over each other, chanting, crying, warning. Leave, or join us, forever. Each phrase dripped with menace, yet he could discern desperation, sorrow, a faint, lingering plea for recognition. By the time he reached the library, Jonathan's sense of time had warped. The room was vast, with towering shelves that reached the high ceiling, crammed with books, ledgers, and journals. On a central table lay a thick, leather-bound book with no title. Hesitant, he opened it and gasped. The pages detailed events that had never been recorded anywhere else. The sisters' meticulous planning, the concealment of victims, the construction of secret chambers and hidden tunnels beneath the mansion. Each entry revealed a cold, precise intellect devoted to preserving their secrets and maintaining control over the mansion and the town. The sisters had been methodical, their crimes hidden not by chance but by design, ensuring that even the closest neighbors remained oblivious or complicit. A faint tapping drew Jonathan's attention to a corner of the room. There, an old mirror reflected the room, but something was off. His reflection did not move with him. Instead, two shadowed figures lingered behind him, indistinct yet unmistakably feminine. He spun, but the space behind him was empty. The mirror remained. Jonathan's breath quickened. He had read the journals, traced the markings, but he had not yet felt the sisters' presence so directly. It was here, in this reflection, that he realized the mansion had eyes, and the sisters had never truly left. Determined to document everything, Jonathan returned to his journal, but the whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent, forming words he could barely comprehend. Find them. Remember. Hide. Each word was an echo of centuries-old intent. He paused, lantern trembling in his hand. The mansion demanded recognition, acknowledgement of the horrors it had housed. The more he delved, the more it seemed to test him, probing his resolve and sanity. Hours passed. The line between night and day blurred, and Jonathan realized he had been wandering for what could have been minutes or hours. Every room he entered seemed familiar, yet altered. A shifting labyrinth designed to disorient intruders. He understood why the townsfolk spoke of madness. The mansion's very architecture was a trap, a mental gauntlet meant to bend perception and prey upon curiosity. Yet, despite the fear gnawing at him, Jonathan pressed forward. Somewhere deeper within these walls lay the truth, the ultimate revelation about the Blackwood Sisters and the 84 corpses hidden beneath their cursed home. And with each step, the whispers grew more desperate, more insistent, as if urging him onward, guiding him to a revelation that would forever change his understanding of the mansion and of human depravity. Jonathan leaned against the library's towering shelves, trying to steady his breath as the weight of what he had uncovered pressed down on him. The mansion itself seemed to pulse, a dark rhythm in the walls and floorboards, as though anticipating his next move. He turned back to the leather-bound journal, flipping through pages that chronicled the lives of Eliza and Margaret Blackwood. Each word painted a portrait of beauty, intelligence, and refinement. But beneath the surface, a shadow lurked, one that had been present since their earliest days. Born into wealth and privilege, the Blackwood sisters were the daughters of Horace Blackwood, a mining magnate whose empire stretched across California, and Victoria Blackwood, a woman of strict propriety and brittle affection. The household was vast, grand, and isolating. Nannies and tutors raised the girls with rigid discipline, their every action observed, corrected, and scrutinized. Though educated beyond what most women of the era received, the sisters were denied freedom, their creativity and intelligence trapped within a gilded cage. Over time, the confinement warped into obsession. Where other children might have sought companionship in peers or play, Eliza and Margaret turned inward, cultivating a private world of imagination, cunning, and dark curiosity. The journal detailed the gradual unraveling of their morality, beginning with small acts of cruelty. Animals in the mansion's gardens, birds, cats, and rabbits, disappeared mysteriously. Tutors and servants who displeased them suffered punishments both petty and cruel. But as the sisters grew older, their cruelty intensified, their ambitions twisting into something far more sinister. Jonathan read accounts of their first experiments with the concept of control. The neighbors' missing livestock, the servants who vanished for days only to return with hollow eyes and terrified silence. These early acts were mere preludes, rehearsal for a far darker theater of life. By the age of 20, the sisters had inherited their father's estate in full, their wealth providing the means to enact their obsessions unchecked. The mansion became both stage and instrument of their control, each corridor and room designed to manipulate, disorient, and ultimately dominate all who entered. Jonathan's fingers traced diagrams in the journal, maps of hidden compartments, secret tunnels, and false walls. The sisters were methodical, deliberate, their intellect paired with a cold, unyielding ruthlessness. Every victim, every secret passage, every corpse concealed was evidence of their meticulous planning. Jonathan could almost see them through the words on the page. Eliza, tall and commanding, her sharp eyes missing nothing, issuing cold, calculated instructions. Margaret, graceful, yet equally terrifying, her soft voice carrying threats veiled in sweetness, her smile hiding a mind obsessed with cruelty. Together, they were a perfect storm, sisters bound by blood, obsession, and a shared delight in dominion over life and death. They were not merely cruel. They were architects of fear, sculptors of a terror that would echo through generations. The journal recounted their social lives as well, which served as both cover and instrument. The sisters attended balls, hosted lavish dinners, and maintained appearances of refinement and benevolence. Townspeople admired them, spoke of their elegance and charm, unaware of the shadow that trailed behind every smile. The journal suggested that Eliza and Margaret delighted in this duality, the veneer of civilization masking the horrors lurking beneath. Jonathan shivered, imagining the calculated performances, laughter masking malice, hospitality concealing a deadly design. Jonathan turned the page to one of the most chilling entries, detailing the sisters' transition from cruelty to murder. The journal was methodical, listing dates and methods with chilling precision. The sisters had begun selecting victims among the townsfolk, those who were inconvenient, disobedient, or merely curious. They had no remorse. Their actions were clinical, almost ritualistic. Each murder was followed by concealment, the construction of hidden rooms and chambers to hold the bodies. Jonathan's lantern flickered as he read, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The mansion's walls, it seemed, had absorbed these acts of violence and now resonated with them, echoing each detail in the creaking floorboards and shifting shadows. The sisters' descent was not born of madness alone. The journal hinted at something darker, a perverse philosophy of immortality. By hiding the corpses, preserving them within the mansion's walls, they had achieved a form of dominion over death itself. Each body was a testament to their intellect, their cunning, their absolute control. And yet, there was fear too. A fear of being discovered, of losing the mansion and their empire of secrets. This fear drove them to greater cunning, reinforcing a cycle of cruelty and obsession that would eventually claim 84 victims. Jonathan's eyes widened as he realized the scope of the horror. The sisters were not mere criminals. They were predators. Predators who had built a labyrinth of terror over decades. The mansion itself was a collaborator, its architecture a silent accomplice, every hidden panel and secret chamber a reflection of their warped genius. And now, as he wandered through the mansion centuries later, Jonathan understood that the sisters' influence remained. Their presence was woven into the very fabric of the estate, a persistent shadow that lingered long after death. He could almost hear their voices, soft and commanding, whispering behind closed doors. Every hallway, every staircase, every hidden compartment was a memory of them, a fragment of their obsession frozen in time. Jonathan realized that the mansion was more than a house. It was a tomb, a monument to the Blackwood Sisters' descent into darkness. And if the mansion allowed him to uncover their secrets, it would also test him, tempting him with curiosity, taunting him with whispers, daring him to cross the boundary that separated the living from the dead. Jonathan paused, lantern shaking, in his hand. He had read their story, traced their descent, but he had not yet seen the results of their design. Somewhere in the shadows, beneath the floorboards and behind hidden walls, the evidence of their obsession awaited. 84 lives, stolen, preserved, and concealed. The mansion's pulse quickened, the whispers growing urgent. The Blackwood Sisters. Descent was complete, but the echoes of their reign of terror had only just begun to claim Jonathan's attention. Jonathan moved cautiously through the mansion, the weight of the sisters' legacy pressing upon him. Each creaking floorboard under his boots seemed to groan in warning, and every shadow twisted unnaturally, as though the house itself watched his progress. He had spent hours poring over journals, sketches, and hidden clues, and now he felt compelled to uncover the physical evidence of the Blackwood Sisters' crimes, the 84 lives concealed beneath the mansion's surface. The hallway narrowed as he approached the north wing, an area that appeared untouched for decades. Dust motes floated in the lantern light, drifting like tiny specters, and the air grew colder, heavier, infused with a faint metallic scent that made Jonathan's stomach churn. At the far end, he noticed an unusual seam in the floorboards, a narrow gap running along the wall, almost imperceptible to the casual observer. He knelt, running a gloved hand over the boards, and felt a subtle depression, as if the wood beneath had been hollowed. Heart-pounding, Jonathan retrieved a small crowbar from his satchel. Each lever and tap of the tool produced a groaning protest from the mansion, as if the house resented his intrusion. Finally, a section of floor lifted with a dull snap, revealing a hidden staircase spiraling downward into darkness. A rush of cold air surged from below, carrying a faint stench of decay, mixed with dust and mold. Jonathan took a deep breath, steeling himself, and descended. The staircase ended in a narrow tunnel, its walls constructed of rough-hewn stone, damp to the touch. Every step echoed, amplifying the sense of isolation and dread. Jonathan's lantern revealed more than just stone. There were markings on the walls, scrawled in an almost artistic hand, a record of the victims' names, dates, and, occasionally, cryptic symbols. He realized that this hidden network of tunnels was a repository of memory, each carving a testament to the sisters' meticulous planning and obsession with permanence. As he advanced, the tunnel opened into a series of chambers, small rooms, stacked like cells beneath the mansion. The smell of rot was stronger here, and Jonathan fought the urge to gag. Against the walls were remnants of life preserved in horrifying fashion. Personal effects, clothing, shoes, jewelry, carefully stored as though catalogued. Some chambers contained skeletal remains, others mummified bodies, their eyes long gone but still conveying a silent accusation. The sisters had hidden 84 people in total, each room a macabre shrine to their obsession. Jonathan walked through the chambers slowly, documenting each discovery in meticulous detail. He noted the variation in preservation. Some victims appeared almost untouched by time, their clothing intact, a grim testament to the mansion's strange, almost supernatural environment. Others were skeletal, reduced to bare bones, a grim reminder of the passage of decades. Each chamber bore signs of careful construction, false walls, hidden doors, narrow ventilation shafts. The sisters had planned every detail, leaving no trace for the casual observer. He paused before a particularly large chamber, the walls lined with iron racks and shelves. A series of journals lay scattered on the floor, likely dropped in haste or disuse. Jonathan picked them up, leafing through the pages. The sisters had chronicled every detail of their work, every concealment, every method of subterfuge. They wrote of the excitement, the precision, the thrill of control, but also of fear, the fear that someone might uncover their secrets. Each page was more disturbing than the last, detailing techniques for moving bodies, avoiding suspicion, and maintaining the mansion as a perfect cage of silence. As Jonathan explored, a faint sound echoed through the tunnels. At first he thought it was the settling of stone and wood, but it grew clearer. Whispers, soft but deliberate, murmurs of voices carried by the cold draft. Jonathan, it seemed to call, almost pleading. He froze, heart hammering, trying to rationalize the sound. Perhaps it was the wind passing through narrow ventilation shafts, or maybe a trick of the acoustics. Yet, as he shone the lantern toward the far end of the chamber, shadows seemed to twitch, the darkness deepening as if alive. Moving forward, he discovered another hidden door, partially concealed behind a false wall. Prying it open revealed a spiral staircase descending even further, the darkness beyond impenetrable. He hesitated, knowing that each step carried him deeper into the mansion's heart of horror, closer to the full truth of the sisters' crimes. The air grew heavier, saturated with the residue of decades of death and obsession. Jonathan's lantern flickered, and he felt a cold brush against his neck, as if unseen eyes were observing him. In the deepest chamber, Jonathan found a final, horrifying detail, a room entirely dedicated to records of the victims, arranged meticulously on shelves and tables. Each entry contained the victim's name, date of disappearance, and a small sketch, perhaps a memory of their face, preserved in the sisters' own hand. The scale of their obsession was staggering. 84 lives, each reduced to data points, each human story transformed into a permanent testament to the Blackwood Sisters' genius and madness. Jonathan shivered, realizing that these hidden chambers were not merely graves. They were monuments to a methodical, cold-hearted philosophy that viewed human life as something to be catalogued, controlled, and preserved. A sudden gust of wind extinguished his lantern, plunging him into near-total darkness. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices, some pleading, some accusing, some menacing. Jonathan fumbled to relight the lantern, and when the light returned, he saw movement, shadows flitting along the walls, shifting shapes that defied explanation. The mansion was alive with memory, echoing the sisters' obsession and demanding recognition. Every skeleton, every artifact, every hidden passage bore witness to their descent, and now the mansion itself seemed to awaken, testing his resolve. Jonathan realized that he had uncovered only part of the truth. The chambers beneath the floorboards revealed the extent of the sisters' cruelty, but the mansion had more to tell, secrets even darker and more intricate than the 84 bodies he had documented. Each step forward was a negotiation with fear itself, a delicate balance between fascination and horror. And as he traced his fingers over the cold stone and carved names, Jonathan understood that the mansion's whispers were not just echoes. They were warnings, or perhaps invitations, to delve even further into the darkness the Blackwood Sisters had created. Jonathan emerged from the bowels of the Blackwood mansion into the crisp night air, his clothes dust-covered and his lantern flickering as though exhausted from its own ordeal. The mansion loomed behind him, dark and brooding, a testament to centuries of obsession, cruelty, and secrecy. Yet even as he caught his breath on the overgrown front lawn, he could not shake the feeling that the mansion's influence extended far beyond its walls. The whispers beneath the floorboards were nothing compared to the stories that lingered outside, in the small town nestled at the foot of the hill. By morning, Jonathan had made his way down to the town itself, a cluster of weathered wooden buildings and dusty streets where life appeared untouched by the horrors atop the hill. He entered the general store, hoping to gather local histories, to understand how the Blackwood Sisters' crimes could have gone unnoticed for so long. The shopkeeper, a lean man with wary eyes, greeted him with polite suspicion. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, voice low. Jonathan shook his head, and the man's eyes flicked nervously toward the hills. "Best you leave well enough alone. Folks around here, we don't talk much about Blackwood." Jonathan pressed further, asking about the disappearances, about missing neighbors, about the whispered rumors that had drawn him here. The responses were evasive, dismissive, or cloaked in superstition. "People just moved away," one woman said vaguely. "Never was nothing there. Just an old house," another claimed. But Jonathan sensed fear beneath their words, a carefully cultivated silence that hid decades of complicity. The town itself was complicit in maintaining the secrecy of the mansion and the sisters' crimes. Fear and reputation had silenced them, and even generations later, the echoes of that fear remained. He learned from fragmentary accounts that the sisters had been both feared and admired. Their father's wealth and influence had cemented their place in local society, and their outward charm masked the horrors they committed behind closed doors. Families who questioned them suddenly relocated, servants disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and neighbors learned quickly that interference carried consequences. Jonathan pieced together a grim pattern. The town's silence was not born merely of ignorance, but of self-preservation. The sisters' reach had extended far beyond the mansion, entwining itself into the social and economic fabric of the community. Jonathan's investigation led him to the oldest building in town, a library whose walls were lined with newspapers and public records dating back decades. Here, he found more evidence of the town's dark silence. Reports of missing persons were brief, inconsistently recorded, and sometimes explained away with improbable causes. Vanished while gathering firewood, moved to San Francisco, disappeared in the night. These explanations, conveniently vague, masked the truth. Jonathan realized that the town had learned to rewrite its history, to bury inconvenient truths beneath layers of polite denial. Yet there were hints that some townsfolk remembered, fragments of memory passed down in whispers between generations. An elderly man spoke to Jonathan in hushed tones about a night he had spent as a child, watching the sisters' carriage arrive and leave with strangers who never returned. Another mentioned the peculiar layout of the mansion, the way it seemed to shift and hide its secrets from prying eyes. These stories, half-formed and tremulous, hinted at a collective memory that refused to die entirely, even as the town outwardly maintained silence. Jonathan felt a growing unease. The town's silence was not passive. It was active, protective, a shield for the mansion and the Blackwood Sisters' legacy. He realized that the horror was not confined to the walls of the estate. It had seeped into the lives of every family, every neighbor, every street and alley. The town itself had become an accomplice, a living extension of the sisters' control, their fear and fascination perpetuating a cycle of secrecy that had allowed 84 lives to be concealed beneath the mansion for decades. As he walked the empty streets, Jonathan observed subtle signs of this ongoing vigilance. Shutters seemed to twitch at his approach. Doors closed just slightly more firmly when he passed, and even stray animals scattered, as if sensing an unseen threat. The town's history was written in layers of omission, its memory sculpted by fear. The Blackwood Sisters had created more than just a house of horrors. They had orchestrated a society in which silence and denial were tools of survival. The deeper Jonathan delved, the more he understood the magnitude of the conspiracy. The town's dark silence had been maintained through intimidation, wealth, and carefully cultivated appearances. People had chosen to look away, to allow evil to fester in plain sight, and in doing so, they had become part of the story. Jonathan felt a chilling clarity. To truly uncover the mansion's secrets, he could not rely solely on physical evidence. He had to confront the lingering influence of fear, the psychic residue of centuries of complicity, and the whispers of the townsfolk who had learned to live alongside evil without naming it. By the end of the day, Jonathan returned to the mansion, carrying with him fragments of the town's memory and a growing sense of urgency. The whispers beneath the floorboards, the journals and the hidden chambers were only part of the story. To understand the Blackwood Sisters, to truly confront their legacy, he had to navigate the intersection of history, memory, and fear. The town's silence was a living thing, intertwined with the mansion's architecture, the hidden chambers, and the very souls of those who had disappeared. As twilight descended once more, Jonathan ascended the hill toward the mansion, aware that he was now more deeply entwined in the web of the sisters' design. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, the air heavier, carrying with it the weight of decades of concealment. The town slept below, ignorant or complicit, while the mansion waited, patient, for the next chapter to unfold. Jonathan understood that he was no longer merely an observer. By choosing to enter, to uncover, he had become a participant in the mansion's story, a story that demanded to be completed, even if the cost was unimaginable. Night had fully descended over Blackwood Mansion, and Jonathan felt the oppressive weight of its history pressing in on him from every angle. The wind whispered through the broken windows, carrying voices that seemed to emerge from nowhere, layering over the soft creak of the mansion's old bones. Every shadow looked alive, every flicker of lantern light a fleeting figure just beyond the edge of vision. He realized, with a chill crawling down his spine, that the mansion was no longer merely a structure of stone and timber. It was a vessel for memory, and memory had grown sentient in the hands of the Blackwood Sisters. Jonathan descended again into the hidden tunnels beneath the mansion, the lantern casting flickering light across the walls, lined with carved names and dates. The ghosts of the 84 victims seemed to hover in the corners of his vision, half-seen forms pressing at the edges of his consciousness. Their presence was undeniable now, not just as a haunting whisper, but as a force that clawed at the edges of reality. Each footstep he took was met with a chorus of murmurs, some pleading, some accusatory, and some, terrifyingly, almost jubilant, as if celebrating the return of an intruder to the sisters' carefully maintained domain. As Jonathan moved deeper, he encountered his first direct manifestation. In a narrow chamber lined with shelves of personal effects and skeletal remains, he saw two figures emerge from the shadows. At first they appeared as hazy silhouettes, but as he focused, their features became discernible. Tall, elegant women with cold, piercing eyes and expressions frozen in imperious disdain. Eliza and Margaret Blackwood. They did not speak yet. Their presence communicated 1,000 threats at once. Warnings not only to leave, but to understand the gravity of trespassing on their dominion. Jonathan's heart raced, yet his determination did not waver. He had come for the truth, and he would not be cowed by the echoes of the past. The sisters' ghosts did not attack physically, but their influence was palpable. As Jonathan passed, the air grew icy, his breath forming visible clouds, and the lantern's flame flickered violently. Objects shifted subtly around him. Books slid from shelves, floorboards groaned under invisible weight, and shadows twisted unnaturally, forming shapes that mimicked the human form. Each chamber seemed to carry the imprint of past horrors, a memory replaying endlessly in the mansion's consciousness. The ghosts were tethered to this place, bound by obsession and cruelty, unable or unwilling to leave. Jonathan moved with painstaking care through the maze of hidden chambers. The whispers followed him, forming coherent phrases that chilled him to the bone. "Remember us," one voice hissed. "Never leave," another moaned. "Join," a third whispered with urgency. The mansion itself seemed to respond to his thoughts, guiding him toward the deepest, most secret parts of its underworld. It was as if the ghosts had accepted him, not as a threat, but as a witness to the legacy of their torment. They needed someone to understand, someone to acknowledge their existence and the horrors inflicted upon them by the Blackwood Sisters. In a particularly narrow passage, Jonathan found a chamber unlike the others. The walls were lined with mirrors, cracked and warped, reflecting infinite repetitions of his own terrified face. And within those reflections, the sisters appeared again. Eliza and Margaret, always observing, always judging. Their eyes seemed to pierce the surface of the glass, seeking acknowledgement of the crimes they had committed and of the lives they had claimed. Jonathan felt a tremor of fear and fascination. He realized that the mansion had trapped more than bodies. It had trapped essence, memory, and willpower. These ghosts were more than echoes. They were extensions of the sisters' consciousness, guardians of the horrors below. Jonathan pressed further, following a faint glimmer at the far end of the mirrored chamber. There, in a small alcove, he discovered artifacts that had not yet been catalogued. Personal belongings of the victims, carefully preserved, along with letters and journals that had never been seen by the world. He sifted through the materials, reading the final words of lives ended prematurely, feeling the weight of each story press into him. With each page, each artifact, he sensed the ghosts grow more insistent, their whispers forming a chorus of gratitude, grief, and anger. They were both victims and witnesses, demanding recognition, demanding that their stories be told. Suddenly, Jonathan felt a hand, cold, almost imperceptible, brush against his shoulder. He spun around, lantern trembling in his grasp, but no, one was there. The shadows shifted again, and he realized the mansion's ghosts were not static. They were aware, interactive, bound to the space, yet able to reach out, test, and guide. The sisters' presence was stronger than the victims', a constant, commanding influence that sought to maintain dominion over the mansion. But the victims' spirits were growing bolder, coalescing, urging Jonathan onward toward the final revelations. Hours passed, or perhaps only moments, time losing all meaning in the mansion's depths. Jonathan's mind struggled to process the relentless interplay of light, shadow, and whispers. He understood the mansion's dual nature. The sisters' malevolent genius preserved their power, while the ghosts of the victims asserted their own presence, resisting invisibility, demanding acknowledgement. It was a war of wills, centuries in the making, and Jonathan was now caught in the middle, both observer and participant. Finally, he reached a chamber at the absolute heart of the mansion, where the whispers intensified to a deafening chorus. The air was thick, heavy with centuries of despair, rage, and unfulfilled longing. Here, the ghosts of the 84 victims seemed almost tangible, their forms shifting between corporeal and ephemeral, urging Jonathan to see, understand, and remember. The sisters' spectral forms hovered at the edges, commanding yet restrained, aware that their dominion was being challenged by the persistence of memory. Jonathan's breath caught as he realized the mansion itself was a living chronicle, a repository of horror and obsession that demanded witness. The ghosts, both victim and tormentor, had created a delicate balance, and he, by surviving, by observing, by recording, had become the first human in decades to walk among them without falling prey to madness. The mansion's shadows were no longer just threats. They were guides, leading him to the ultimate truths that lay hidden beneath layers of stone, wood, and time. Jonathan stood in the heart of Blackwood Mansion, surrounded by the shifting presence of 84 restless spirits and the lingering, commanding specters of the Blackwood Sisters. The chamber felt alive, vibrating with centuries of trapped anguish, cruelty, and obsession. His lantern flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that writhed along the walls like living things. Every heartbeat echoed in the chamber, mingling with whispers that now sounded like desperate voices begging for release, for recognition, for justice. As he stepped forward, Jonathan noticed a small, concealed door at the far end of the room, partially hidden behind layers of stone and shadow. The journals and artifacts he had collected in the deeper tunnels seemed to point him toward it, as though the mansion itself were guiding him. With a mixture of fear and determination, he approached and pushed the door open. Beyond lay a narrow spiral staircase, descending even further into darkness. The air grew colder with every step, heavy with the metallic scent of decay and the faint hint of something sweeter, a perfume that seemed impossibly old. The staircase ended in a hidden crypt, its walls lined with shelves and niches, each containing personal effects, skeletal remains, and mummified bodies. Jonathan counted them silently, dozens of small compartments filled with evidence of the sisters' reign of terror. Here, at the deepest point of the mansion, He finally understood the full scale of their obsession. 84 lives meticulously catalogued, preserved, and hidden away. A twisted monument to control and cruelty. The Blackwood Sisters had constructed a labyrinth not merely of wood and stone, but of human lives, each one a piece of their dark design. A sudden chill swept through the chamber, and Jonathan turned to see the sisters' spectral forms materializing fully. Eliza and Margaret, ethereal and terrifying, floated above the crypt, their eyes piercing his very soul. Yet there was something different this time. Their presence was not solely menacing. There was hesitation, almost acknowledgement, as though they recognized that Jonathan had unearthed the truth they had so carefully concealed. Their whispers, once commanding and sharp, now mingled with the voices of the victims in a chaotic chorus, creating a dissonant symphony of past and present. Jonathan realized then that the mansion itself was a sentient archive, a vessel for memory, and that he was now part of it. To leave without understanding would be to dishonor the lives of the victims. To stay too long risked his own sanity. Steeling himself, he examined the final journals and letters scattered across the crypt. Among them was a ledger in the sisters' handwriting, detailing the last victims, the construction of secret passages, and even coded warnings for future generations. Every entry, every note, seemed designed to preserve not only memory but the psychological architecture of fear itself. Suddenly, a shadow darted across the room. Jonathan's lantern wavered, and in the brief flicker of light, he saw the victims, ghosts coalescing, their faces filled with sorrow and plea. The sisters' forms hovered at the edge, restrained, almost watchful, as though permitting the dead to act. A realization struck Jonathan with unbearable clarity. The spirits of the victims were guiding him, showing him a way out of the mansion, a path that respected both their suffering and the lingering malevolence of the sisters. He followed a narrow, hidden passage revealed by the shifting shadows, moving quickly but cautiously. The walls seemed to pulse, the air thick with energy, and the whispers escalated to a deafening crescendo, a mixture of accusation and lamentation. Every step was a negotiation, a careful dance between the living and the dead, the observer and the observed. Finally, after what felt like hours but might have been mere minutes, he emerged into a long-forgotten servants' corridor that led directly to the mansion's overgrown gardens. The moonlight bathed the exterior of the house in a pale, spectral glow, highlighting its twisted beauty and the weight of its dark history. Jonathan paused to catch his breath, the night air tasting sweet and cold. Behind him, the mansion seemed to pulse one final time, as though acknowledging the completion of a cycle. The whisper subsided, replaced by a profound silence. He realized the Blackwood Sisters' reign of terror had not ended, it had simply shifted. Their story, now witnessed and recorded, was no longer hidden. And yet the mansion retained its power, a sentinel over the dark legacy that had unfolded within its walls. As he made his way down the hill toward the town, Jonathan reflected on the enormity of what he had discovered. The mansion, the sisters, and the 84 lives trapped within were more than a historical curiosity. They were a testament to the extremes of human obsession, the dangers of secrecy, and the resilience of memory. Every step he took away from Blackwood Mansion carried the weight of witness, the burden of truth, and the haunting knowledge that evil, no matter how thoroughly hidden, leaves traces that endure. By dawn, Jonathan had reached the outskirts of town. The first light of morning spilled across the dusty streets, illuminating buildings that had long whispered secrets of complicity and fear. He felt both relief and sorrow, knowing that the town's silence had enabled horrors beyond imagination, but also a glimmer of hope that acknowledgement, documentation, and remembrance could serve as a measure of justice. He had survived the mansion, witnessed its deepest horrors, and now carried the story into the world, a story that demanded to be told. Jonathan looked back once, toward the hill where Blackwood Mansion loomed, silent yet alive with memory. The wind stirred, lifting the edges of broken shutters and the ivy that clung to its walls. The mansion had allowed him to see, to learn, and to escape, but it remained, eternal and watchful, a monument to cruelty, obsession, and the indelible presence of the Blackwood Sisters. And somewhere, beneath the floorboards, In the tunnels and chambers filled with artifacts and bones, the 84 voices continued their chorus, no longer entirely hidden, their stories finally recognized. Jonathan turned away and walked into the light of morning, the mansion fading behind him but never truly leaving his mind. He had entered a house of horror and emerged with understanding, a witness to history, a bearer of truth, and a man forever changed by the shadows, the whispers, and the ghosts among the walls.